Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Tuesday, March 14th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 172 days. The game against Michigan in 256 days. Every once in a while, I'll take a look back through some recent weeks of this show just to see, what are we doing too many shows about this, or do we need to have someone else on that we haven't had on for a while? And here's a little confession time. I was a little aghast when I looked back to see how long it had been since we had our good buddy Ross Fulton on. The answer was way too long. We're going to fix that today. Ross is my guest as we are heading into the spring break week for Ohio State. So no spring football, but it's still a great time to talk about spring football with Ross. And Ross, it has been too long, but thank you for joining me once again.
I've just been enjoying my break, Tom. No, in all seriousness, glad to be back. Thanks.
Yeah, we're through 2 spring practices now, and now the coaches and the players all have a week off. Coaches are out doing recruiting stuff. Players are out doing, whatever players do. You remember spring break when you were in college. You know what they're doing. But while they're out doing that, we're going to talk a little bit about what's kind of still to come with spring football. Some of the things that Ross is really most interested in watching this year in spring ball, because there are a million different storylines. But it's always interesting to me what certain people on our staff are maybe watching most closely, and sometimes it's stuff you're not necessarily thinking about. So let's start with number one. I asked you, what are 3 things you were kind of most interested in this spring? And you said first thing that came to your mind was the safety positions and how that's all going to shake out in terms of different guys in different roles this year. Yeah.
So, I think that there are, on the one hand, there's more options there, which I think is probably a good thing. But I do, I'm intrigued both just in terms of who are the 3 guys lining up, and I'll include the nickel in that. An entirely separate discussion of, I think people sometimes get confused, calling the nickel a safety versus the corner. It's kind of the same thing. But in any event, I think the first question is, I feel fairly confident that Lathan Ransom is going to be starting somewhere, but have they, moved him from the boundary safety to the middle safety position? I think that there's some pros and cons to that. I do think that, as of last year, Josh Proctor, and I'll get to that in a second, was also a boundary safety. So I guess it would make sense to move Ransom. But, they do ask that boundary safety, as, Ohio State fans witnessed in the, against Georgia, to, have to carry a slot vertically and play some man coverage. And so, you are, by moving Ransom to the middle safety, taking someone out that can do that probably better than some of the other options. So, which gets then to the second point of, is it going to be, if you are moving Ransom, is it going to be Josh Proctor at that boundary safety? Is it going to be Sonny Styles? I think, myself and others probably for a while was assuming that it would be Styles, but, increasingly based on Knowles' comments and about Josh Proctor and the fact that he came back in general, I'm assuming there were some discussions there, and he clearly has the first shot at it. So, and then, if it is Proctor, then I think there's questions of maybe how they would use Styles, and, that gets to more of the structure of the defense and potential changes.
Well, then let's talk about the structure of the defense and potential changes there, because, he's someone who, if you have Proctor and you have Ransom, Styles is probably not playing the nickel position. So, but they've talked about the fact that they really want to get him on the field. And you have 2 linebackers who are both returning starters, and you got Cody Simon, who they keep talking up. So, where would Styles fit at that point, and how does that maybe fit into, so the broader conversation about changes in the defensive scheme this year, just, ways Jim Knowles is going to kind of tweak things heading into year 2.
Yeah, I'm assuming that Jahad Carter will be the nickel, the transfer from Syracuse. And again, when you think back on the safety play last year, the issue was improving in coverage. And so, that does, both Proctor and Styles are, or at least their strengths have been playing more in the box. In fact, even when asked about it last week, both, I think, Ryan Day and Jim Knowles, to paraphrase, something along the lines of, we really like Styles in the box, near the line of scrimmage. He did well in that role. You brought up Simon, but the thing is, if you look at the schedule this year, they had an unusually high number of teams they played last year where they wanted to have a third linebacker. I think a lot of those are gone. I think you could similar to Georgia. See, essentially Styles just be that role, and they'll, as Knowles hinted at or suggested, perhaps like Simon is, rotating in at the Mike and Will position some at getting reps. Obviously, I'm sure there is a desire there to keep him from transferring, and so they want to find some way to get him on the field probably. But so I could see them using Styles or Proctor, I guess the loser of that battle, so to speak, in that sort of hybrid Sam linebacker, third, bigger safety role. That gets into the structure questions. I mean, I think there's a lot of focus last year. Was Knowles too aggressive, not aggressive, aggressive enough? I just think that they got kind of predictable, and they simplified things as the season went on. Maybe that was the result of the first year, and only he can have a grasp for how well people are handling things, but for instance, like a lot of it was just sort of like all or nothing. Like they were either bringing 4 guys or they were bringing 6 and 7, and there weren't a lot of use of things that we've talked about before, like simulated pressures or creepers, where you're bringing 4, but one of them is a linebacker or defensive back. You're dropping an end into zone coverage, or like zone blitzes where you're bringing 5 people and having 6 back. Like for instance, against Notre Dame, they ran. I even think probably you and I talked about it after the game, like several hot coverages where they're bringing 6 and playing like 3 deep, 2 under zones, and like that kind of stuff kind of disappeared as the season went on. Like they became increasingly reliant on man. And again, like my guess is that probably, it's just a matter of like when you're looking at the film, even if something doesn't bite you earlier in the season, you're like, we're not executing that very well. But I think some of that needs to come back. Like, he used more cover 4 type coverages at Oklahoma State that were largely not there last year. And so I do think, when he's talking about protecting players and building up, to me, that was my takeaway from that comment was like, we became too predictable. So by the time you get to the end of the year, like you could predict, like if you put your slot to the boundary, you're going to get the boundary safety and covering him in man. And then you've gotten the nickel into the box and the run support. And so you've sort of weakened the structure of the defense. So I do think that there is certainly steps to improve it. That obviously doesn't even get to, everyone's favorite topic of the jack position. And I mean, as Knowles correctly said, like they just were flat out really bad executing and run support. Like, I didn't think Jack Sawyer was very good at it. They didn't have the defensive tackles to hold up playing like a straight nose guard. I mean, essentially what they use the jack for is just to run an odd front and change up like the blocking schemes. But they got gashed when they did it. So, whether they can, I mean, I do again think it's nice to have variety, but obviously you got to be able to execute it first and foremost.
Well, when you're looking at those limited looks and some of the stuff that they're trying just isn't working last year, this may be an impossible question, and if so, you can just say that's a stupid question. How would I know that? But is that year one and they're just not up to speed on the defense and he hasn't gotten everything installed yet and that people aren't comfortable with it? Or is it, hey, this is a defense that was recruited by a whole different coaching staff running a whole different scheme, and now we're trying to run his scheme, but we don't have guys who, this has not been a defense where Jim Knowles has been picking like, aha, this is the guy I want for this spot and that's the guy I want for that spot. It's just kind of, you got to kind of make it work the first year, and then you start bringing your guys in for subsequent seasons. So is that a year one, they have to pick it up and it'll be better in year 2 because it's year 2? Is it a personnel thing from last year that might be better because they're bringing in different personnel this year? You get Mitchell Milton back. Does that help? I mean, how do you attribute those, that all that different stuff?
Yeah, I think it's some of both. I mean, I think that, Knowles is coming into a situation where the players were very used to a very like specific 4-down single high scheme. I mean, he has, Larry Johnson, that's what he's coached forever. And so you're trying to mesh and probably build upon itself. You don't want to get too far ahead of guys. That's where you're, again, the seeing that like the jack odd front's a perfect example. Like if it doesn't work, there's no reason just to do it, just to do it. They also were still very young on defense last year. I mean, they got a ton of guys back this season. So, you should really see improvement just personnel wise, in addition to being more familiar with the scheme. I mean, as you said, like he continues to praise Melton whenever he gets a chance. So maybe he's able to bring something. I mean, they do have pieces that they can use. I mean, some of it's sort of unproven, like, a Sonny Styles. We've obviously, like, they thought enough of him to play him against Georgia. But, so you do have some situational pieces there as well. That'll be interesting to see how they use them. But, it does start with, I think they did they did a pretty good job last year of like shoring up the run deficiencies that had really gotten them in 2021. And so now I think they just need to diversify their coverages and obviously be better in the back end. And that also probably starts with having, healthy corners and not having like a rotating set of bodies each week. It was, Georgia was maybe the first game that they had their both corners healthy.
Yeah, instead of having 2-ish healthy corners, they're going into the spring with at least 6 and maybe 7, and so yeah, that's definitely going to help this year for sure. Looking on the other side of the ball, it was obviously season 1 for Jim Knowles at Ohio State last year. It was also season 1 for Justin Fry at Ohio State last year. Now in season 2, he's got a fancy new title. He is the run game coordinator now. And you said you were kind of interested to see what does that mean? What kind of changes are there scheme wise to the run game this spring?
Yeah, and again, some of this is just surmising, but I mean, Kevin Wilson has obviously was always a huge proponent of outside zone or stretch. I don't think that's going to go away, but Justin Fry, at least when he was with Chip Kelly at UCLA in recent years, it was a more diversified scheme, more gap, power, counter Trey, and interestingly enough, even against Georgia, they ran counter Trey more than they had probably for the last half of the season. Again, it's like, then it's always like, well, is it something they saw in film? Was that just because Justin Fry was having a bigger influence because Kevin Wilson was starting to transition? But I am looking to see if they have, and I think, as we've talked about, they would benefit from a more diversified run game. I think I saw, some discussion after the first practice, like even they were, the first thing the offensive line was working on during the media availability was polling, which obviously is a gap scheme thing. So as opposed to working on your outside zone steps. So that's just a little thing, but and you can obviously read too much into it, but I do think my guess is we see a more diversified run game that isn't quite as reliant on stretch and uses some more gap blocking principles.
And with as many different running backs as they have, I mean, they've got 5 returning scholarship guys who have all played some kind of significant minutes somewhere at the college level. How does that maybe fit into what they try and do this fall? Does having, an Evan Pryor at the same, in the same position as a Mayan Williams and a Chip Trayanum, where you've got maybe different sizes, different skill sets, does that impact sort of the diversity of what you might try and do this fall?
Yeah, it could. And I would include Xavier Johnson in that as well. I mean, we saw, he had quite an impact out of the backfield, both on the edge as well as, as a receiver. So, it is again, last season was sort of a eye opener where it's like, oh, they got 5 running backs they're pretty deep there. And it's like, well, I guess we saw last year that can disappear quickly, but yeah, I would say that at least, you have at least, Mayan Williams and, I would say Travion Henderson included and Chip Trayanum, who are all, to me, power rushers, more or less. And, guys who need to get north and south and are good in gas schemes. But then you have a couple guys like Johnson and Pryor who can, you want to feature on the edge. So again, I do think that that's a reason, particularly, if the quarterback isn't going to be a heavy part of the run game, again, all the more reason that you need to have a diversified run game so that you aren't, defenses can't play your tendencies.
All right, well, we are going to make sure it is not quite this long again the next time before you hear Ross on this show again. I'm sure we'll have much more stuff to talk about as spring ball rolls on. Buckeyes have off this week, of course, but then back next week, and then they'll start scrimmaging over the weekends the next couple weeks, and it all ends with the spring game on April 15th, so there should be lots to talk about, and I promise we'll bring Ross back before the spring break game to go through more of the stuff so that he can point out stuff like, hey, here's the first thing the offensive line was working on during spring ball. Here's what it might mean, because that's the kind of stuff that sometimes even we don't notice as we're taking pictures and running around and trying to watch at 6 different position groups. One of those really interesting little nuggets here that you only get from Ross and all of our X's and O's gurus at BuckeyeHuddle.com. We have an active thread on the board, just answering your X's and O's questions and talking about that kind of stuff, making you a little bit of a smarter football fan. And you can be a part of that thread and part of that community and part of all the great stuff we do there by signing up to be a member at BuckeyeHuddle.com. It is the price of a lousy chain store pizza, and it gets you access to our full team of insiders covering the team, covering recruiting, covering schemes and X's and O's and all that good stuff, all at BuckeyeHuddle.com and at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.